The Dubai skyline shimmered under the merciless afternoon sun as Chief Engineer Rashid Al-Mansoori leaned back in his leather chair, the soft hum of air conditioning filling his 42nd floor office. Blueprints lay scattered across his desk like fallen leaves, but one folder sat apart, thin and unimpressive, its cover marked with a simple name: Engineer Mateo Cruz, Philippines. Rashid flipped through the pages with careless fingers, his lips curling into a smile that soon grew into laughter. The idea before him felt like an insult to his decades of experience. Bamboo reinforcement in a 40-story skyscraper rising from the desert sands of Dubai? To Rashid, it sounded like madness disguised as innovation. He slammed the folder shut and scoffed aloud, mocking the unseen engineer behind the proposal. "Bamboo in a tower of steel and glass?" he muttered, standing to gaze at the skyline he had helped shape for 30 years. Towers of concrete and steel stood proudly because of men like him, men who respected tradition and power. Without reading past page 20, he stamped the proposal rejected, unaware that the decision he had just made would soon haunt every foundation he had ever trusted. Thousands of kilometers away, in a modest apartment in Manila, engineer Mateo Cruz stared at his laptop as the rejection email appeared. His face did not twist in anger. Instead, it hardened with quiet resolve. Mateo was no ordinary engineer. He was raised in a coastal village where bamboo houses withstood typhoons that crushed concrete homes like toys. He had watched bamboo bend, scream, and survive, while modern materials cracked and failed. His blueprint was not a joke. It was the result of 12 years of research, field tests, and sleepless nights. That night, rain lashed against his windows as Mateo reopened his rejected proposal. He ran his fingers across the diagrams, remembering the disasters he had studied: collapsed bridges, failed towers, and lives lost because engineers refused to listen to nature. "They will learn," he whispered, not in pride, but in sorrow. Somewhere deep within him, a fear stirred, not for his reputation, but for what would happen if arrogance continued to rule engineering decisions. Back in Dubai, Rashid announced the approval of a massive new project, the Al-Sahra Crown, a 40-story luxury skyscraper meant to redefine elegance in the desert. Construction began with celebration, cameras flashing as dignitaries praised Rashid's brilliance. Steel pillars rose from the sand, and concrete was poured day and night under blinding lights. Rashid walked the site like a king inspecting his kingdom, confident that nothing could go wrong under his command. Yet as the building climbed higher, strange sounds began to echo through the structure at night. Workers whispered of groans and vibrations they could feel beneath their boots, like the tower was breathing. Engineers dismissed it as normal stress adjustment, but a few older workers refused to work night shifts, claiming the building felt angry. Rashid laughed when he heard the rumors, unaware that the desert had begun testing his certainty. An independent safety consultant submitted a report highlighting unusual stress readings in the lower columns of the Al-Sahra Crown. Rashid skimmed it briefly, irritation flashing across his face. The numbers suggested flexibility issues, too much rigidity, not enough adaptive movement. It reminded him, uncomfortably, of the bamboo proposal he had laughed at months earlier. He shoved the report into a drawer and ordered construction to continue without delay. That same week, a minor tremor shook the outskirts of Dubai. It was weak, barely noticed by the city, but inside the tower, cracks whispered through fresh concrete like spiderwebs spreading in silence. Security cameras caught support beams shuddering for seconds too long. When a junior engineer tried to raise concerns, Rashid silenced him with authority. "Fear has no place in engineering," he said firmly.
not realizing fear was exactly what had been keeping nature's designs alive for centuries. In Singapore, the World Sustainable Engineering Conference gathered the greatest minds from across the globe. Mateo Cruz stood nervously backstage, holding revised diagrams of his bamboo hybrid structural system. His presentation was scheduled late, after most attendees would be tired, but fate had its own timing. Moments before his turn, news broke across the conference hall screens. Structural instability detected in a major Dubai skyscraper project. The room buzzed with tension as Mateo stepped onto the stage. Instead of panic, his voice carried calm authority as he explained how bamboo, when treated and engineered correctly, absorbed seismic stress better than steel alone. Images of bamboo bridges surviving earthquakes flashed behind him. When he reached the final slide, he paused. "Rigid structures break," he said softly. "Living structures survive." The silence that followed felt heavier than applause. Rashid watched Mateo's presentation later that night, alone in his office. Each diagram felt like a blade cutting through his certainty. The stress patterns Mateo described exactly matched what the safety report had warned about. Outside his window, the Al-Sahra Crown stood unfinished, its skeletal form illuminated against the dark sky like a giant waiting to fall. As another tremor rolled through the region, stronger this time, the building groaned audibly. Emergency alarms blared as workers fled the site. Rashid rushed downstairs, heart pounding as he felt the ground beneath him. For the first time in 30 years, fear wrapped its hands around his chest. He realized then that experience without humility was nothing but blindness. The tremor escalated into a seismic event that sent shockwaves through the city. Glass shattered in nearby buildings, and the Al-Sahra Crown swayed violently, its rigid steel frame resisting the movement until resistance became agony. Concrete cracked, columns screamed, and the tower leaned just enough to terrify everyone watching. Sirens wailed as evacuation orders echoed across the site. Rashid stood frozen as part of the structure collapsed inward, not outward, saving lives but exposing the fatal weakness of the design. Dust swallowed the air, and screams mixed with the sound of breaking metal. In that moment of horror, Rashid remembered the bamboo blueprint he had rejected without reading. The realization struck harder than the quake itself. At dawn, with the city still shaking from aftershocks, Rashid made a call he never thought he would make. His voice trembled as Mateo answered from Manila. There was no accusation in Mateo's silence, only calm listening. Rashid admitted everything: his arrogance, his dismissal, and the disaster now threatening Dubai's reputation. Mateo agreed to come, but not as a subordinate. "I will help," he said firmly, "but we rebuild with respect for nature and for truth." When the call ended, Rashid felt lighter and heavier at the same time, knowing that redemption would demand humility greater than any structure he had ever designed. The world watched as Mateo arrived in Dubai, escorted into the damaged site. Media mocked the idea of bamboo in the desert, but Mateo worked silently, overseeing the integration of bamboo-steel composite reinforcements. The treated bamboo flexed under pressure tests, absorbing shocks that steel alone could not. Engineers who once laughed now stared in disbelief. When controlled stress tests were conducted, the reinforced sections held firm, bending slightly and returning to form like living boons. The desert winds howled around the tower, but this time the structure answered with resilience instead of resistance. Rashid watched from below, his pride replaced by awe and quiet shame. Another tremor struck weeks later weaker than the first, but strong enough to test the rebuilt sections. Cameras rolled as the tower moved. Yes, moved, but did not crack. It swayed, absorbed the energy, and stood tall once more. The crowd watching live gasped as engineers shouted in excitement. For the first time, Rashid smiled without arrogance. Tears blurred his vision as he realized that innovation did not destroy tradition, it evolved it. The building had survived because it was allowed to behave like nature intended, not because it was forced to stand rigid against it. Engineering journals exploded with headlines. Universities rewrote textbooks. Bamboo hybrid structures were no longer jokes, they became the future. Mateo Cruz was hailed as a visionary, but he remained humble, crediting villages, ancestors, and nature itself. Rashid publicly admitted his mistake, shocking the construction world even more than the earthquake had. In a rare moment of global unity, engineers agreed that the disaster had been a warning, not a punishment. A warning against arrogance, against ignoring wisdom simply because it came from unfamiliar places. The Al-Sahra Crown became a symbol, not of failure, but of transformation. Years later, elders would tell the story like a modern folk tale. They spoke of a tower that nearly fell because men believed strength meant stiffness. They spoke of a Filipino engineer who listened to the whisper of bamboo and brought life into dead steel. And they spoke of a proud man who learned humility before it was too late. At sunset, the Al-Sahra Crown glowed softly against the Dubai sky, standing not as a monument to power, but to balance. And somewhere in the wind, if one listened closely, the tower seemed to breathe, alive, flexible, and ready for whatever the earth dared to challenge it with.